actually going to go straight to this notion of protected areas, social-ecological systems. And this is not a room where I need to convince anyone that thinking about protected areas or conservation systems as social-ecological systems is a good idea. And I think in the conservation discourse that's been more and more recognized. It used to be only sort of certain pockets, but we're seeing it now very widely recognized in management and practice and policy. But what does that mean? Thinking about conservation systems as social-ecological systems, well, broadly it's sort of two things. The one is that conservation systems are complex systems, and they are also systems where people and nature are intertwined. And that has implications for the kind of approaches that we take to conservation. And so two terms that have, or two sort of literatures that's emerged as really important in thinking about, like, okay, so how do we operationalize, or how do we really engage differently in conservation systems, is the literature around resilience, which really is a literature that helps us to engage with the complexity of systems, and the literature around equity. Thinking about people in nature and not just people and nature. I think a social-ecological systems perspective, and this is our argument, really compels us to recognize that equity and resilience are really can't really be separated. So I know that's not how everybody thinks about it, but I think the way that we've thought about it in this project, if you argue that if you think about systems as being connected and you're thinking about people and nature as being part of those connections, then undermining people's equity really impacts the resilience of that system and vice versa. So anyway, so what we wanted to do in this group was to really bring those two literatures together. So we had two objectives. The first was to sort of conceptually bring those literatures together, to think about conceptually what do we mean by equitable resilience. And really the way we thought about it was expanding the sort of the resilience element to include equity, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And then we wanted to synthesize lessons on building equity and resilience in conservation systems in Southern Africa. And that's a bit much for one talk, so I'm going to skip over the conceptual part a little bit, and then I'm going to unfortunately skip a little bit over some of the lessons, but hopefully leave you with some food for thought for the discussion later on. So the way that we sort of entered this was by engaging with this literature on principles for building resilience. So this might be something that's familiar to many of you, and so I think over the last 30 years or so, there's been a number of efforts to synthesize lessons from theory, but also from practice, like a lot of these lessons from practice on how do you actually build resilience in systems and distilling them into these sort of best practice principles. And I think the most famous one of these principle sets is the Big ZL 7 principles, but there are many more out there. And so we did a sort of a process where we synthesized did a systematic literature review, and we eventually used these 14 sets of principles. Don't worry about what they are because there's too much conceptual stuff to contain here. But we identified those sort of 14 principles as 14 of the main ones that have had these lessons. And as you saw in the previous slide, there's sort of sub things, like the principles are things like maintain diversity and redundancy in the system, manage connectivity, manage slow variables and feedbacks, encourage learning, broaden participation. So these are things that you can do to build resilience in your system. So we had 14 sets of those things. We sort of looked at connections between them, and then what we wanted to do is we wanted to expand each of those, the themes that we came up with, and there were 20 of those, which I'm not going to show, but we wanted to expand them to also account for equity dimensions. And many of them already did, but what we mean by equity dimensions here is as you've heard before, sort of the recognitional, procedural, and distributive equity. So just to take this down like a little bit slower, say one of our themes was around system boundaries and identity, like defining the system boundaries is an important theme, an important thing you need to do when you're thinking about resilience. But if you expand it to also think about, say, the procedural dimension or procedural equity dimension of that resilience principle, maybe you need to think about the full and effective participation of recognized actors in decision making, and you need to maybe think about venues and fora where relevant actors can participate in boundary setting. So that's kind of what we did for these 20 additional themes that we identified. And so we had sort of these 20 resilience themes, and then we came up using these expanded equity principles. We came up with 43 equity principles. And of course, like that's not really something you just want to deliver to someone and go like that, let's do that. So what we could do though, by linking a little bit like the overlap between these like different principles and themes was to come up with how these kind of principles link together. And so that enabled us to, this is like a little bit hard to see, but to come up with sort of a theory of change for building equitable resilience. And so if you think about equitable resilience of social ecological systems, and you can think about this as like sort of Vision 2040 if you want, like this is where you want to come. So obviously we're also using a normative definition of resilience here. But then you can think about sort of the themes around participation and learning. Those are things or principles that you can implement, and when you think about like who's there and where are they taking place and how are you doing them, those are all sorts of things that can then help build diversity and redundancy and heterogeneity in the system. They can help sort of manage these organizing sort of systemic properties of social ecological systems to get to where you want to be in the end. And so from this exercise, this is just to, like, wanted to get to this, but just to explain that there was a process to get to that. We identified these 7 leverage points for building equitable resilience in conservation systems. So in our theory of change, if you paid attention to these 7 things, you could get at these other 20 themes and these other 43 equitable principles like most efficiently. It's not really like I don't know if the order of those are correct, maybe for discussion. What they are, defining appropriate system boundaries, enabling broad, meaningful, and effective multi-level participation, establishing appropriate venues and fora at multiple scales, learning about the past and anticipating of the future, supporting diversity, heterogeneity, and redundancy, identifying and managing feedbacks, and then supporting broader transformation to an enabling context. Have I reached 5 minutes yet? Oh, okay, so I don't have much time. Okay, so what we then did was we kind of reflected on these leverage points in a number of different systems, sort of at the level of the agency. So we looked at sandparks, Zim parks, Namibian conservancies, and South African wildlife ranches. And I'm just going to leave you with three insights from reflecting on how those leverage points have been sort of pulled at in those different systems. So I'm going to skip over what that was all about. So the first big insight here is that meaningful participation across scale matters for outcomes. And one thing that really gets ignored a little bit in the equity literature is this not only participating in meaningful ways at one scale, like it has to happen at different scales. And fortunately, I don't have to talk very much about that because I think many of the talks in the previous session really spoke to that, and also like how learning is a really important thing to do in these places where you're engaging. Another thing that I maybe want to just point out here is that, and thank you, Jonathan, for your talk, because now I don't have to talk too much about this, but that monitoring and evaluation, and Yureta, is really a key opportunity for connecting people in nature and with each other. This is a really key venue or fora where people can actually learn, anticipate, sense what feedbacks are, and where also a lot of transparency and good governance can happen. Then a second one, I think, that was very interesting when reflecting across the different countries, and this wasn't one that was on our radar. It's not even like properly a leverage point, which is maybe means we need to go back to the leverage points a bit. But it's system memory, and that came out across all 4 of the case studies. And this is about, an example maybe is in Zimbabwe. There were like lots of good ideas in Campfire, and the way, and very like nice structures that were set up, and good outcomes and benefits that were flowing to people, but that was very much undermined by by ignoring, and it's unfair to just pin this on Zimbabwe, this is true across all cases, sort of ignoring the fact that conservation is happening here in almost like in traumatic contexts, that these are landscapes where people have been displaced, where there's cultural trauma, and that ignoring this past and this trauma and these contexts really has really important potential consequences. Am I at 1 minute yet? Okay, I'm time up. Okay, sorry. Last one. Don't ignore system memory. The last one is just around transformation to an enabling context, and I'll say this very quickly. That Isak's point earlier around like reflecting over 30 years and looking across these case studies, there's really a lot of evidence that there has been a lot of transformation that's already happened in these systems, and that over the last 30 years there's been a lot of shifting to spaces, to an underlying logic that is that really recognizes that people's connections with and the value of nature really matters, and then sort of the creation of platforms to operationalize that in a way that that really shapes a better conservation system and better outcomes for people. And then the final thought here is just that I think in a space where we're moving into sort of mega living landscapes and that sort of thinking, I think it's also important to not forget that I think area-based conservation systems are really undervalued sources of broader conservation that we need in our societies. And there I will stop.